Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon and welcome. The thing with the market economy is it's very close to the problem with democracy. They both don't work very well, but they're the best models we know of. This session's title, Market Economy, Reinvent or Reboot, could have been the title of a session 20 years ago or 10 years ago. But it's this year's title, so we want to specify why we're discussing this issue today. We're talking about the European economy, so basically a bunch of economies that are very different from each other, and within each other there are big differences as well. Is the promise of capitalism dishonored? Growth rates are low, top wages and capital incomes are increasing while medium wages are stagnating. It seems that the middle class is left behind, interest rates are down, unemployment is high, youth unemployment is high, our pension systems are vulnerable, our social security and health systems are endangered. We undergo massive centrifugal forces to the right and also to the left. The promise of capitalism is we might have to accept inequalities, but everybody will benefit. Not long ago, one could picture our children being better off than us. That is the promise, but today only very, very few people believe so. How bad is the situation and how bad do things have to be for us to be willing to change things? Let me quote. We need to explain to the ones who are afraid of the future, of refugees, of globalization, that things aren't as bad as they seem, says one of the two gentlemen that will take place on this stage very soon. We're at a turning point. Europe is being torn apart. Capitalism is going through a spasm, says the other. I'm sure it's unnecessary to introduce these two gentlemen, these two economic professors, to you, and I would like them to come on stage now, please. The president of the Institut, Leibniz Institut für Wirtschaftsforschung an der Universität München, Clemens Fuest. And the co-founder of DM25, professor of economic theory at the Department of Political Economy at the University of Athens, also known as the former Greek Minister of Finance, Yanis Varoufakis. So how sick is the patient, Professor Fuest? May I ask you for your input about the condition of the European market, and we'll say about 10 minutes maximum each. Wherever you please.
Okay, good afternoon. Thank you very much for the invitation and for the very kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here in Alpbach. This is my first time in Alpbach, and I already enjoy it. So let me come to the subject of this session. So in fact, what I'm going to do is defend something very unpopular, which is capitalism and the market economy, and I'll try to do it in the following way. I believe that if we talk about the market economy or capitalism, we are really talking about economic systems where governments and markets interact. So things like pure capitalism or the pure market economy systems don't really exist. Globalization, economic globalization, doesn't exist independent of economic policies. In many areas, it is a result of economic policy. So if we think about what's going well in these systems or what's going bad economically, I think we need to do so considering the interaction between economic policies and regulations and the way the private sector behaves. All results, good or bad, are the results of this interaction. Now, I think it is widely accepted that capitalism produces good results when it comes to things like having goods produced efficiently or making sure that the economy produces goods consumers really want and these things. I mean, there were times when people thought that a centrally planned, a rationally planned economy could do that better. But I think intellectually this idea was never very convincing, and empirically this idea has been discredited with the end of communist systems and the fall of the Iron Curtain and the collapse, really, of communism at the end of the 1980s. But, you know, this victory of, let's say, mixed capitalist systems doesn't mean that everything is going well in capitalism. And I believe there are maybe three main points of critique of our current, I suppose, mixed systems. The first critique, and maybe the main critique, is that capital systems lead to inequality and poverty. I mean, they may lead to productivity and efficient production, but the critique is capitalism leads to poverty and inequality. The second criticism is that capitalism leads to, at least doesn't prevent the destruction of the environment. You know, all these issues like climate change and so on are very pressing issues. And the third point, more specifically, the third critique is that capitalism has caused the financial crisis, or excesses of capitalism have caused the global financial crisis in the year of 2008. Now, I would like to focus on two of these points, inequality and the financial crisis. And I would like to argue that capitalism, first of all, does not systematically lead to more inequality. And I would like to argue that the recent history of global capitalism is one where capitalism has led to more equality. It is a history where capitalism has led to less poverty. And I believe this is something we need to understand to come up with reforms, because I'm not saying that everything is fine or that we don't need reforms, but I think we should have the facts clear. And the second point I would like to make is that it is not an excess of capitalism that has led to the financial crisis, but mostly misguided regulation, misguided social policies with very good intentions. Finally, in the end, the financial crisis was caused in many areas by too little capitalism, not too much capitalism. Now, that might sound weird to you, but let me explain it. First, the issue of inequality. Now, let's take a look at the facts. In 1981, 44% of the global population, 44, were living in absolute poverty. The World Bank defines absolute poverty as a daily income below $1.99 US. 44% of the world population were living in absolute poverty in 1981. In 2012, 13% of the world population are living in absolute poverty. Still too many, but poverty is not increasing. Poverty has declined dramatically on a global scale. How about inequality above the poverty line? In 1980, average per capita income of developing and emerging countries was 14% of the industrialized countries. Today, it is 23%. So there is an income convergence worldwide. If we look at the world as one country, if we look at every citizen as simply a citizen of the world, and if we measure inequality among individuals, we see that in 1988, the Gini coefficient, which is one of the standard measures of inequality, was 74. In 2008, it was 69. So worldwide inequality among individuals has declined, it hasn't increased. Now, of course, that has been achieved by the economic emergence of China and many East Asian countries. You know, Africa has been doing very badly. But on a global scale, inequality has declined. And what has brought this decline? It's not governments that redistribute income through taxes and transfers. It is governments that have opened up their countries to trade. So it is economic globalization that has brought this reduction of inequality. It is true that in the industrialized countries, low-skilled labor has lost, or at least, you know, as was said, suffers from stagnating incomes. But this is a direct consequence of increased competition from emerging economies. What can we do about that? We need good schools or better schools. We need the governments to provide social safety nets. And there are some countries where this doesn't work. For instance, the US. and there are other countries where things work quite well. Austria is one of them, Germany is another one. So here social safety nets have a huge impact providing security. Let me come to the second point, the financial crisis. Now, one of the key reasons for the financial crisis was the emergence of subprime loans, low quality loans, and those were basically the results of policies that aimed at giving poor people access to home ownership in the US. This was a social policy program, but its impact was quite bad because people, took up loans that didn't have the income to pay for these loans. Okay, and this led to banks, repackaging these loans and everything that came afterwards. But this is not capitalism. It was a social policy that triggered things that eventually contributed. It wasn't the only reason contributed to the crisis. And the crisis was also caused by misguided regulation, allowing banks to operate with very little equity. This fact, combined with the fact that if a bank collapses, the impact on the economy is very bad, this has led governments to save banks using tax money. This was simply a misguided regulation. Capitalism is a system where investors lose their money, not other people's money, lose their money if they get it wrong. And what we need is banks with more equity so that when they speculate, they lose their money, not taxpayers' money, when things go wrong, meaning one of the implications of the financial crisis is that we need simply more capitalism and not less. Thank you.
Professor Varoufakis, the stage is yours. The stage is yours.
I've got my clock here just to make sure that I don't overdo it. Thank you so much, Rosa. Thank you, Clemens. Thank you all. Thank you to the Alpbach Forum for the invitation. These are the kinds of debates that we need a lot more of, especially during a period of incredible stress for our common European project. Now, the question around which this meeting was organized, free market, is it still the optimal model? Can it face up to the challenges of today? I'm afraid that this is an excellent question for the 1920s, perhaps for the 1980s, but not so much for today. Today is more of a distraction. In the 1920s, when the debate, capitalism or central planning, state or the spontaneous order, was all the rage, it was an exceedingly interesting debate, Friedrich von Hayek accurately and presciently said that the problem with central planning is that socialism, to be implemented, requires means that even socialists would disapprove of. In 1991, he was confirmed. Now, the trouble, however, is that the alternative ideology of free markets, of liberal economics, had its 1991 moment in 2008. Because it was at that point that the illusion that deregulated financial markets will be self-correcting and riskless risk was possible within the free market environment, that crashed and burned just like the dream of central planning crashed and burned in 1991. Today, we can plagiarize von Hayek by saying that the problem with liberal economic ideology is that to implement it, we need policies that liberals would disapprove of. So it's not a question today between free markets and collective agency solutions or state-like solutions. The reason, primarily, as Clemens said, that we cannot have a free market model on its own, is that there are two markets that refuse to operate along the lines of market economics: the market for money and the market for labor. It is that failure of the market mechanism in those two realms which necessitates a mixed economy, a blend between the two, and which makes the simple juxtaposition of free market, liberal economics, and social democratic, collective agency kind of economics, this juxtaposition null and void from the point of view of that which matters in our day and age. Let me give you an example. The European Union. The European Union is disintegrating in front of our eyes. And I'm not saying this with any degree of satisfaction. I say this with alarm and with a great deal of regret. But we need to call a spade a spade if we're going to prevent the disintegration of our common project. Now, why is it disintegrated? If you look at the DNA of the problem, what you will find is the European Union was neither created along the lines of liberal economics thinking, free market thinking, nor on socialist principles. The European Union began as a cartel of heavy industry. The first name was the common market of coal and steel. Later, we co-opted the French farmers through the common agricultural policy, and so on and so forth. It was a cartel. This sort of resonates with what Clemens was saying, that maybe the problem is not too much capitalism, but too little. Not too much free market ideology, but too little. Or, to be more precise, free market ideology used as a facade to dress up a cartel practice. Now, the first 20 years, 50s and 60s, during which the European Union, the common market, grew, they were splendid years. They were years when we Europeans started, despite different cultures and languages, uniting. It was a beacon on the hill for the rest of humanity. Proof that different peoples that were at war until very recently can unite, can get together, and can create the dream of shared prosperity. But remember, the 50s and 60s was a time when the global environment, even the domestic environment within the European common market, European Union of the time, was shaped by the United States of America. They were providing the macroeconomic management and the currency. Because, let's not forget, we had our own currencies, but we had really one currency, and it was the US dollar. Everything was linked to the US dollar under the Bretton Woods system. It was a common currency system predicated upon American surpluses, current account surpluses, which were being recycled initially through Marshall aid, but later by other means, both to Europe and to Japan. And this is what kept the world of global capitalism stable and allowed the common market, our European Union, to grow. But unfortunately, the linchpin which was holding the whole thing together, American surpluses, disappeared by the mid-60s, and it was only a matter of time before that system, that currency system, was jettisoned, and it was jettisoned on the 15th of August, 1971, when Richard Nixon announced, President Nixon announced what I call Eurexit. Not Grexit, Eurexit. The expulsion of Europe from the dollar zone. Yeah? And then all sorts of troubles began, and we had tumult in the 1970s. We had repeated attempts by Europeans to create our own fixed exchange rate regime to replace the Bretton Woods system that the Americans were husbanding up until 1971. And we had a second period, a period where again the United States economy was regulating the macro environment globally in which Europe was allowed to breathe and to evolve. This time, by inverting the flow of deficits and surpluses, the United States, instead of recycling its own surpluses, since it had lost them, started recycling everybody else's surpluses through the burgeoning current account deficit of the United States, which was providing German factories, Austrian factories, Dutch factories, Chinese factories, Japanese factories, and so on, with the requisite effective demand. But in order to finance this ever-increasing deficit, we had a reverse flow of capital profits from those surplus countries to the United States economy via Wall Street and financialization. So the reason why we had deregulation, why bankers were allowed to go completely in a frenzy, was because that was an essential part of the post-1980, post-Paul Volcker, if you want, surplus recycling mechanism, what Ben Bernanke accidentally referred to as great moderation. It wasn't. It was the most immoderate, unbalanced equilibrium in the history of capitalism, which collapsed in 2008. Ever since, the global economy is in a tailspin. Ever since, we have not managed, at the level of global capitalism, to create the balance between deficits and surpluses, between capital and current account imbalances, which are necessary to stabilize the world economy. The trouble with Europe, with the Eurozone in particular, which had grown up in the meantime as a result of the failure to establish the EMS without a common currency. The problem was that the euro was not designed to cope with the gigantic, momentous crash of 2008. It was a fair weather design. It is a little bit like removing the shock absorbers from your car and driving it straight into a pothole. First, you make sure you don't have the shock absorbers for absorbing a shock, and secondly, you maximize the shock that's coming. And the result is a tailspin. We are in a period of we started with a great recession. In my estimation, now we've moved to a great deflation, which takes different forms in different countries. In my country, it takes the form of a Great Depression. In Germany, it takes the form of a deflation and negative interest rates that are crushing pension funds and creating serious uncertainty in the mind of conservative average Germans who've been saving all their lives, and now they see negative interest rates eating into their nest egg, therefore fueling discontent. And in the end, just like in the 1930s, whenever you have a great deflation, the first political force to benefit are the xenophobes, the racists, and those who are fueled by the centrifugal forces that are detrimental to our democracy. In the United States, in 2008, when the floor collapsed from under their feet, remember those interesting days in the fall of 2008, about 10, 20 powerful people, mostly men, unfortunately, got around the table and asked themselves a very important question. What must we do to prevent this crisis from consuming us? And they answered it the way they did. It's the right question to ask. I'm not necessarily defending the answer they gave, but at least they posed the right question. What question did we pose here in the European Union? When the great and the good gathered around the table, they asked a different question. The question was, now that the rules we've created for the Eurozone clearly cannot stand and need to be violated, how can we violate them in a way that seems that we're not violating them? Ladies and gentlemen, the answer to the second question can never be the right answer for resolving the crisis. The answer to the first question that the Americans are asking themselves, or ask themselves, can be the foundation of a solution. I shall end by recalling a cartoon that I saw in the 1990s in the Wall Street Journal. It depicted two businessmen, some high-rise building in New York, looking down upon the little people walking in the street, and one of them saying to the other, "We desperately need a totalitarian government to introduce liberal economic policies." Today in Europe, we have a totalitarian troika of creditors whose policies, without any rhyme or reason, are being introduced in a manner that bring about permanent extending and pretending of unsustainable loans in countries like mine, Great Depression in the periphery, they crash pension funds in the core countries like Germany, and they are creating discontent everywhere, with Brexit being just one indication of what follows this combination of inane policies and increasing authoritarianism on the other hand. In conclusion, our choice, ladies and gentlemen, is not between liberal economic ideology and some kind of statist ideology. Our choice is more interesting and more pertinent than that. Either we band together across national borders, not as Greeks or Germans or Austrians or Swedes, but as Europeans, across even political ideologies and even political economic philosophies, liberals and left-wingers, who are connected by one determination: to not repeat the mistake of our predecessors in 1930, just after the 1929 collapse and before the slide of Europe into the abyss, a common determination to make Europe work in a way which is rational, common sense. It stabilizes Europe, and it gives us an opportunity, upon the stabilization of Europe, to have this interesting debate between liberal economic and more left-wing kind of approaches. The alternative is that we will fail and we will not have a decent answer to the question that our children and grandchildren will be posing in 20 or 30 years' time, for those of us who are still around. What did you do to prevent the slide of Europe into a postmodern 1930s? Thank you.
Let's start with inequality. you've just said, and you've written an article in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung a couple of months ago objecting the claim that the gap between the rich and the poor is widening worldwide. But do you really believe there's no problem with inequality on a national level? Median wages in Germany are stagnating, even falling behind the relative to, or at least relative to the top incomes. There's a concentration of wealth and also a concentration of power.
You know, I just think we need, that's why I start this way, we need to get the facts right, meaning globally inequality is falling. Globally inequality is falling, and the fact that the industrialized countries at the very top of the global income distribution have a group which is our low to medium skilled workers. The fact that their incomes are stagnating, true, is a result of globalization and is a challenge. But you know, I think we need to understand the process. Increasing inequality is not an inevitable consequence of capitalism. It is a consequence of you know, certain forms of economic integration we are witnessing now. It is the consequence of stronger competition of products and indirectly really employees and companies from emerging economies. I mean, we want these economies in the world, these countries in the world economy. And it is correct, you know, I believe in any reasonable economic system, earnings will be determined by productivity. And that's why, you know, countries need to invest in education. We need institutions that protect people from income fluctuations, and these are things we have. You know, these are things. If you look at the 25% with the lowest income in Germany, for instance, their share in overall income today is the same as 20 years ago. It's exactly the same. I mean, in the media, the message inequality is increasing in all dimensions is very popular, but it's wrong. You know, simple messages come across very easily, and inequality is increasing everywhere. It's a very popular message, but it's wrong. It's differentiated. It is true, you know, there are challenges, but you know, I don't think there is sort of a dramatic and universal trend towards these things. In my view, inequality is more of a problem in the United States and to some extent in the United Kingdom than in Europe. I mean, the problem of Europe is not that we don't spend enough on social policies. We spend too much, we don't target these things well, but you know, my concern is that by this obsession with a wrong piece of information, inequality is ever increasing, we are going to reduce competitiveness and growth in Europe further, and I think we should do the opposite.
An emergency program for social solidarity is one of your, as you call them, modest proposals for resolving the euro crisis, and you also state that a basic income is a necessity. Clemens Fuest just argued that inequality debate is overdrawn, so are you exaggerating?
I don't believe that that's what Clemens said. I don't think that you believe that the inequality debate is overdrawn. You're asking for a more nuanced debate. That's how I understand it. A more differentiated, not a debate that can be summed up in one short sentence, right? That we have... look, allow me to just comment first on Clemens before I respond to you. Of course, you're right. There's nothing predetermined about inequality rising within capitalism. The period from 1914 to the mid-70s is proof of that. We had a massive reduction of inequality, especially in the 50s and 60s. Massive. And so, clearly, it can't be true that capitalism breeds more and more inequality. But of course, then you have to look at what distinguishes that 70-year period. So then we have a nuanced conversation. Now, regarding the geographic and sectoral distribution of inequality, let me just present my understanding of the data. My understanding of the data is that within the West, both in Europe and in the United States, not just in the United States, we have a substantial, significant, quite toxic politically increase in inequality. Even within Germany, if you look at the rising inequality within the lower 60% of the population, amongst those who, on mini jobs as opposed to those who work for Volkswagen, for instance, it is quite dramatic. The number of working poor in Germany has increased very significantly. So yes, it is true that we have the capacity to rein in inequality, and some countries like Germany do it much better than others. I reject wholeheartedly the proposition that the problem is that we have too much social spending. I come from a country where 9% of the unemployed have ever received a single euro of unemployment benefits, 9%. We effectively in the south, in the periphery, which is the deficit area of the Eurozone and extremely buffeted by the Great Recession, we have almost a breakdown of social welfare. But to answer your question, 2 points you raised, Social Solidarity Fund and actually Anti-Poverty Fighting Fund, let's put it bluntly, and basic income. The former concerns the Eurozone. Now, we in Europe tend to be overly proud of our achievements vis-à-vis the United States of America. We shouldn't. We made this mistake in 2008, remember? When Wall Street collapsed, many people on this side of the Atlantic rejoiced, oh, they were lecturing us, those Anglo-Americans, for so many years about free markets and deregulation and so on, and look at what happened to them. And then 5 minutes later, we discovered that our banks were worse than theirs. So let's be coy when we are critical of the Americans. Think in terms of the centrifugal forces tearing Europe apart. The fact that after the crisis began, because of the problematic architecture of the Eurozone, the Germans have turned against the Greeks against the Germans, everybody against the French, the Brits want to get out. This kind of centrifugal process. Now, imagine if there was a letter containing a check that arrived in the letterbox of every family in Europe that was below the poverty line, struggling to put food on the table for their kids, regardless of geography, in East Germany, in Greece, in France, wherever it happens. And imagine that that check was signed by Mario Draghi on behalf of the European Union. Now, how radical does that sound? Not particularly radical. It's what happens in the United States. They're called food stamps, and they're signed by Janet Yellen on behalf of the Fed. This kind of check, firstly, it's payment in kind. You're not giving money away, but you're allowing families that find it hard to put food on the table to do so. But also imagine the political and the symbolic and cultural impact of having the president of the European Central Bank sign those checks, the unifying effect that that has from Germany to Greece, from Portugal to Ireland, and so on and so forth. We need to do this. There are ways of funding it. Let's not get into the technicalities about it. On the second issue, the universal basic income. This was something I said, not in connection to the Eurozone, and certainly not in connection to Greece. This was a lecture that I gave. I'm actually a convert, a recent convert to the idea of universal basic income. I was not in support of it, even though I was working with people who were for many, many years. To cut a long story short, as capitalism is increasingly producing the technologies that undermine capitalist relations of production, the labor-capital contract in particular, with the breakdown of the differentiation between consumer and producer, employer and employee, and the magnificent, tremendous, fascinating, and at the same time scary prospect of tens, if not hundreds of millions of people losing their job within the next 5 years as a result of machines passing the Turing test and being able to replace not just blue-collar workers and tractor drivers, but also most of solicitors through the algorithmication of their work. The idea of setting aside a percentage of shares in companies to be placed into a trust fund that is collectively owned, from which to fund the basic income, not only for the purpose of looking after people, but also liberating us from the great worry of the distribution of income from a market system that is creating technologies that are moving towards inequality. That is something we need to consider, and I truly believe that it's technological innovation and change that will ensure that basic income will become a must.
Can I react to the basic income idea? I mean, this is a classic idea, which is, let's say, sympathetic, but I'm afraid wrong, and let me explain why. One of the key issues when it comes to doing something for people who are unemployed and have no incomes is the trade-off between, needing a lot of money to provide them with the necessary things and making them work. And the key challenge with basic income schemes is that, if they stop people from working, which they would if, just handed out unconditionally, then they couldn't be financed. It's a very simple calculation. If you paid, let's say, 1,000 euros per month to every German, and you would ask, what is the cost in terms of tax revenue if it would eat up the entire tax revenue? So it doesn't work. Now, of course, you don't want to give everyone this, but you want to give this to people who have lost their jobs and so on. If you give it to everyone, you just need to explain where you get the money for other public services. It simply doesn't work.
It wasn't tax. Didn't I mention?
It falls from the sky, but yeah.
Shares, it returns to capital. A percentage of shares of every new company should go into a public trust fund. Why should my kids and your kids, because we are from a certain social and economic class, which almost guarantees that our kids will have a basic income. Why should they have a basic income and not the kids of everyone?
You would have this would be just another form of tax. So you need people who have this capital, and you take it away from them and put it into the trust fund. This is a tax. Of course, you can say you raise a one-time tax, which is, let's say, 5 times as high as the yearly tax, and that finances the thing. But there's no way of getting around explaining people how this can be financed. If it could be financed, it would have been introduced a long time ago. It has been studied intensively. It would have been introduced a long time ago.
It's like in the 1920s saying that if it was possible to have a society without slavery, we would have done it a long time ago, so we can't do it. That is not an argument.
This debate goes back to the Bible, and it is sad that we don't live in paradise, but we will have to work to earn our incomes, and nobody is going to change that.
But
Okay.
You make an important point about the relationship between income and contribution. It's an important point. But you see, I'm striving. I have a 12-year-old daughter. I want to make sure that, when she's 20, 21, 23, 25, even 30, you never know how life goes, that she will have a basic provision so that I don't have to worry about her being a failure in life, not finding a job, whatever. Now, that doesn't mean that by providing her with a basic income so she doesn't starve on the street, that I don't mind her being idle and a complete social and personal failure. I do not believe that you and I are doing everything we do simply because of the money that we get paid. I do not have this view of human nature. I think that if you cover for the basic income of people, you liberate their creativity. Suddenly they will want to do things. Let's face it, those who are only working just for the euros and the cents that they get are less productive, less likely to invest in their human capital, and less likely in the end to do things that machines will not be able to do in 5 years. As for the point about my suggestion being another form of taxation, it's another form of the state intervening and taking wealth away from people. But that's not taxation. There is a fundamental difference between saying a percentage of your income goes to Wolfgang Schäuble or to Euclid Tsakalotos now, right? And from saying that a portion of the assets of a company belongs to everyone. Why should, let me give an innocuous example, since I don't want to bring our kids back into the... Why should, Paris Hilton have a trust fund? And not everybody, not everybody else, especially when aggregate capital is aggregately produced. Remember, if you look into your smartphone, you will find technologies that were developed by public funds. Every single technology was developed by public funds, every single one. Wi-Fi by CSIRO in Australia. The touchscreen. Everything was done by some, as a result of some publicly funded, taxpayer-funded research project. Now, Apple, Samsung, and so on, Sony, are not sharing those processes. We know that. You read the Financial Times today about Ireland and Holland and so on. We know they don't. Now, why can't we say that since it is impossible to distinguish precisely what each one of us has contributed to our aggregate capital? You see, capital is, to a very large extent, collectively produced and individually appropriated.
Let me ask you a question. So the
standard
sort of middle European welfare state, let's call it, has something like a basic income, which is social assistance, if you have no incomes. I know that some southern European countries don't have that in the same way. And I totally agree, they should have it. I totally agree, but you will never. My children, I know, they might fail in their professions, or if I fail, it's not very likely. But if they fail, they will always have some kind of basic income, housing, food. They will have that. It's simply guaranteed, and there's nobody in Germany who doesn't have it, and there's nobody in Austria who doesn't have it, unless people, don't even, claim what they are entitled to. And I totally agree. This is something that should exist everywhere, but it's not the idea of an unconditional basic income. It's a conditional basic income, in fact. Maybe that's a compromise we can agree on.
I will leave it to Rosa. I have
very short, please, very short.
Well, look, on the one hand, we have the social welfare assistance programs, which are a kind of insurance. Okay, so effectively, after the Second World War, we provided working people the capacity to insure each other and themselves in case they fall out of a job. The rest who are in employment will help them. That is something very valid and still very valuable, so I'm not going to argue against you. But basic income, universal basic income is in addition to it. It's a separate argument. It's about how do we share the returns to capital, especially when capital, with technological innovations in the digital age, has become so collectively produced. Think about Google. Google's money is produced primarily by Google customers. It's not the white knights of investors who go into Google that produce the capital of Google. It's you and me. Every time we search something, we add to the capital of Google. So since we are all contributing to capital formation, why can't we have a trust fund that provides a basic income to everyone?
We all like, it's nothing specific to the digital economy. We all like Mercedes-Benz. Why is Mercedes-Benz a valuable brand? Only because we like it. So we all contribute to the value of Mercedes-Benz. So I think Mercedes-Benz should be mine. I don't think that makes any sense, actually. Of course, there is this issue of taxing these companies, and I agree Google should pay more tax. But, that's not the way we're getting anywhere, I'm afraid. Please.
I'm afraid there is not going to be like one answer from both of you that heads in the same direction. So let's talk about banks. Let's talk about rescuing banks. And let's get concrete. Italy's banks are troubled. Yanis Varoufakis' solution is a case-to-case program that degenerates, uncouples national debts from recapitalizing banks, as the banking union is in a dead-end street, as he writes. Clemens Fuest, would that be a solution?
I believe case-to-case solutions tend to be the right ones. The question is, how do you address these things? The Italian banking crisis is very interesting because it highlights something Yanis mentioned in his introduction. We are making rules in Europe, and when we need to apply them, we break them. The rules, we are fantasizing about what the rules should be like, and then we apply them. The first time we have to apply them, we break them. We had the no bailout rule in Europe saying that governments that go bankrupt, just don't have their creditors being paid back by other countries. And the first time we had this kind of crisis, we broke the rule. And now with the Italian banking crisis, we just introduced the European Banking Union. And the European Banking Union says the creditors will lose 8%, at least the sum of 8% of the balance sheet of each bank before government money is coming in. And the first time we need to apply this, which is the case of Italy, we break the rules. Now, I firmly think that the banking system of the future in Europe needs to be one where banks have a lot more equity and where creditors, senior creditors of banks, not small savers, but senior creditors of banks and those who own banks lose their money if the bank is in trouble. It's the only way of running. Otherwise, if we don't get there, there is an alternative, which is a state-run banking system. We have a state-run banking system, the government runs the banks, and then, we can rescue them with tax money because it's tax money anyway. But we know that the financial sector, as other industries, won't develop if the governments run them. So I prefer a private banking system, but then we need banks with a lot of equity. Now, what's going on in Italy? We have banks that don't have enough equity, and this is, in a way, inherited from the past. So my view is, the creditors that are there need to lose their money. It's very simple, and if we don't get to the 8%, the bank needs to be nationalized, and we need to look individually at the small depositors. Is their individual situation such that the government needs to help them or whatever? But we are doomed if the first time we apply our new rules in Europe, we break them again.
A working paper of the Bank of England says that recent non-standard monetary policy as well as asset purchase programs have mainly helped the rich. The Deutsche Bundesbank has published a statement that argues quite the same. So don't you see a need for mending in this case?
Well, it hasn't exactly helped the rich. It has helped, this monetary policy helps those who have invested in assets like real estate, with long-term fixed rates, with shares. Yeah, I mean, I can tell you, there are rich people. I talked to some yesterday, in fact. There are rich people who have a lot of money in bank accounts, millions, and they are the losers because their interest rates, are simply going down. They are obsessed. You can say, well, I don't worry too much about them because they can live with that. But it's again, it's not rich and poor. It's more differentiated, and nobody knows whether real estate prices are going to stay at this level. Nobody knows, I doubt it, that government bonds will stay at the levels where they are today. So these are unrealized gains, and I'm convinced a lot of people who think they have real estate, which is worth a lot today, can easily be surprised in 10 years when everybody wants to sell off their real estate and lose it. So it's not so easy. I agree that the current monetary policy, the monetary policy we are seeing, is a consequence of the way we have managed the crisis. And I would basically agree to what Yanis said. We decided not to write off the debt. And the alternative to not writing off the debt is setting the interest rate to zero because, the debtors can't pay it back. So there are exactly these two choices. Either you write down the debt immediately, or you say, okay, now let's finance these guys, but they can't pay back anything, and that means the interest rate needs to be zero. And
Yanis Varoufakis, a lot of money has been moved from banks to non-banks, to trusts, to funds. BlackRock, for example, manages $3.65 trillion worldwide. These non-banks underlie other regulations, so it seems that your proposal cannot tackle the ultimate problem, can they?
But my proposal is about tackling the problem of banks. So
what do we do?
You're raising another interesting issue, which is irrelevant to my proposal about the banks. The banks are a problem. They are a huge problem. And it's in Europe, the non-bank sector is not that significant. You're talking about the United States here. So allow me to answer about Italian banks and monetary policy, because otherwise I'll burst. You don't want to see this. On Italian banks. You only need to state the two words to realize the problem we have. We proclaimed a banking union while speaking about Italian banks. There should be no such thing as Italian banks in a banking union. There should be banks that happen to be in Italy. Yeah? In the United States, it made no sense to talk about Texan banks, about Californian banks. That's when you have a banking union. So the problem, Clemens is completely right. We created terrible rules which cannot really be implemented without massive political and social cost and financial cost. And then, of course, we violate the rules, like Maastricht. We created Maastricht, and Germany and France were the first countries to violate. Why? Because they were silly rules. They were rules designed by people who either didn't understand what was going on or were trying to create a crisis just to see whether they can do it. I'm joking, but you know what I mean. Okay, so Italian banks, what is the problem? Your solution, however, Clemens, which is to, okay, we have this rule, let's implement it. I can't agree with this. Why? Because it puts the ECB in a very desperate position, and it also makes the crisis far worse. Think about it. Imagine you are one of the SSM, ECB, decent folk who are sent to Italy, to Portugal, to Greece, to look into the books of a bank and report back to Frankfurt whether this bank is solvent or not. You are in an incredibly difficult position because you're damned if you do, damned if you don't. Let's say you find a black hole there, you know, negative equity, let's say. You discover that this bank is gone, it's solvent. If you announce that, you know that tomorrow morning there's going to be a bank run because no one trusts that the Italian state has what it takes to look after that bank. And if you don't report that, effectively you're not doing your job. So a banking union which does not create a genuine banking union but has common supervision only. Imagine if the United States, the FDIC and the Fed were to send somebody to a bank in Nevada to come up with a verdict as to whether a Nevadan bank is solvent or not, but knowing that the FDIC does not have the right or the opportunity to come and resolve that bank, look after it, recapitalize it, sell it to another bank or whatever. Then you would, this would not be a banking union, it would be a travesty. You would be asking the Federal Reserve's person, employee, to do something that cannot be done, to choose between starting a bank run or lying while on duty. This is what we're doing to our own ECB people with these rules. Now, you said that 80%, okay, bail-in in Italy, senior bondholders. Well, the problem, as you know, with all these poopsie-whoopsie Italian banks is that the senior bondholders include mom-and-pop families who were sold falsely bonds, private bonds by these banks, being told that they are safe as houses, that they, you know, it's just a way of getting a higher interest rate. And now you're going to have to call all those people in the process of rationalizing and resolving banks that cannot be truly and well rationalized and resolved when everybody knows that it's the Italian fiscally stressed state that must in the end provide the backstop for a deposit guarantee and so on. So this is why my suggestion, which you mentioned very briefly about step by step, is how about creating a banking union step by step, saying that every time there is a problem with a bank, the national government can say, okay, I am waiving my right to participate with this. The ECB then immediately appoints a new board of directors. Together with the ESM, they recapitalize it or resolve it or sell it to another bank. And it is not, and that's how you break the doom loop between the insolvent bank and the fiscally stressed, quasi-corrupt state government. And that applies to Greece primarily, but also to other countries. On the question of monetary policy and quantitative easing, look, the problem with quantitative easing is that it is the only thing that a central banker like Mario Draghi can do when you have a mountain of savings that you mentioned, a mountain of savings and very little investment demand due to the deflationary period and the negative expectations. When you have this kind of excess supply, the price keeps falling. But the trouble is, unlike the market for potatoes, if you have excess potatoes, too many potatoes, you reduce the price, at some point they will get sold. The problem with money is that if you are in a deflationary period like we are, and you have excess money, excess savings, and very over investment, you reduce the interest rate, investors get spooked even more, and demand for investment falls even more, and you don't clear the market. And then the interest rate falls into negative territory, reflecting the failure of the macroeconomy to boost investment through monetary policy. Now, we've known that monetary policy, once you get caught up in this liquidity trap, cannot provide the solution. And then Mario Draghi simply has no other option but to start purchasing assets and purchasing assets. His own rules have been bent slightly by him, very, very elegantly and extremely skillfully. He had to do it. I do not criticize him for it. But he can only bend them so far. So he needs to buy assets. What assets does he buy? Assets that belong to the banks. And what do the bankers want to sell him? Mortgages, government debt, and so on and so forth, right? So when those banks discard that paper that goes to the ECB, then they are willing to provide more money to business. But business is spooked by the falling investment. And they do not want to stick their heads out. They do not want to, if they felt that everybody else would be investing, they would be investing. But they feel that no one else will be investing, so they're not investing. Therefore confirming in an ever-ending loop of self-confirmation the low investment expectations. And then what happens? Who wants to borrow money? Corporations. Corporations borrow money. You have Apple, for instance, that is sitting on 200 billion of cash. Yeah? And they're still borrowing 150. And what do they do with it? Why do you want to borrow if you already have a lot of savings? Well, because if the interest rate is almost zero, you borrow to buy back your own shares, to boost their price, to boost your bonus, and this is how the rich get richer as a result of a QE process which is simply not capable of getting us out of the deflationary period. And this is why we need an investment policy that brings together investment arms of the European Union, like the European Investment Bank, with the central bank.
Short answer.
Yeah, let me maybe react to the banking union question. I agree, a fully fledged banking union needs some kind of common deposit insurance. And I also agree, we shouldn't talk about, in a fully fledged banking union, we shouldn't talk about Italian banks or German banks. It wouldn't be important. Now, the trouble is, we don't have this banking union because we have the legacy debt. So we have some countries where banks are highly indebted, where they have non-performing loans and all of these things. And it has been very difficult politically to deal with these issues. As often in politics, it's very difficult to put on the table that things have gone really wrong. It's easier to pretend they haven't gone wrong. And that's why we pretend that the Italian banking sector is, well, there are some small problems, but it's more or less okay. No, it's not okay. There are huge losses. We don't know how much, in fact, and that's part of the problem. These things need to be written off, and as long as these assets are not written off, we cannot have a banking union. So in that way, we are blocked. Maybe one word about the macroeconomic situation. I think here it's very much the same. So my assessment would be we are in some kind of Japanization scenario. This is the legacy of the debt crisis. We have a lot of people, companies and countries that are highly indebted. And if you're highly indebted, you don't consume, you don't invest, you try to bring down the debt. And that's why we are in this situation. Again, I think we cannot address this by going even deeper into debt, and maybe that's a difference between us beyond this agreement. By spending more, we need to get rid of the debt, and again, that's very difficult.
We agree entirely. But that was the whole point. Yeah. You bring in the insolvent bank under the tutelage of the ECB and the ESM.
The trouble is the ECB cannot make debt disappear. I think that's the illusion. We cannot solve our problem by...
But the ESM can. It can replace the debt with long.
No, it's just another debt. It's another form of debt.
But at the same time, what you do is you have. Look, I'm only suggesting that we do that which Wall Street bankers do every day, which is they write off part of the debt, and they replace another part of it with long-term new debt. But overall debt shrinks. So I agree with you that debt must shrink overall. What we're doing today in Europe is we are accelerating the pace of growth of debt while extending and pretending.
I think the main issue is finding the victim. Who is going to have his assets written down?
Talking about victims and talking about debts, let's talk about Greece and Germany. Clemens Fuest, do you believe that the reform programs in Greece do not have the backing that would be needed by the government? Yanis Varoufakis used to be in charge as finance minister, and his point of view is that German and French banks were saved, not Greece, and he calls the austerity measures that have been forced onto Greece fiscal waterboarding. No? Okay.
Tell you what I call.
Tell me.
I can explain.
Okay.
No, look, I think that with Clemens we will agree on some things and disagree on others. Where I think we will agree concerns the terrible deed of 2010, May 2010, the bailout. To put it very simply and bluntly, in terms that everyone can understand, my 12-year-old daughter understands it. The Greek state went bankrupt. Yeah? And instead of accepting it, what we decided to do as the European Union, in all our glory, we decided to give the largest loan in human history to the most bankrupt European state. Pretending that you can resolve, as Clemens said before, unsustainable debt by piling more unsustainable debt, even larger, the largest loan in history, I repeat that, in absolute, not relative terms. Yeah? On condition of austerity measures, which would guarantee a shrinkage of the income, which was not enough to pay the old debts. Now the shrinking income was meant to pay off the old debts and the new debts. That's not fiscal waterboarding. That's just stupidity. Yeah? Now let me tell you what fiscal waterboarding is. The Troika comes to Athens, they walk into your office if you're the minister, and they say, okay, now you've signed this bailout deal, you owe one part of the Troika, let's say the IMF, 3 billion by tomorrow morning. Now we agreed that we will give it to you, but you know what, before we do this, we need to cut off 100 euros of a 300 euro monthly pension for the poorest of the pensioners. And if you don't do this, tomorrow morning we won't give you the money, the IMF will declare you to be in default, the ESM will follow because of cross defaults, and then you'll be dumped out of the euro. And the government holds on until 9 in the morning, trying to convince them, but you know what, we have a country which is full of corruption, we have all these oligarchs, they're not paying anything, are we going to attack the little person who makes 300 euros and cut it to 200 euros? Don't you think that this is politically toxic? The Nazis of the Golden Dawn Party are going to make gain? No, you do it. 10 to 9, the Prime Minister calls, the Finance Minister says, do it, or otherwise we are in default to the IMF tomorrow. That's fiscal waterboarding. It's the equivalent of taking the victim, the CIA does that famously, you put the head under the water, just before suffocation comes, that's waterboarding. You bring the head out, a few more gulps of oxygen, then back in. This is what we've been doing in Greece since 2010. Policies that are accelerating the debt deflationary crisis, which are shrinking GDP, and which are making Greece unreformable because we've lost the population, are being enforced through fiscal waterboarding.
Very different. Joseph Stiglitz wrote an article saying Germany likes to blame the victim, pointing to Greece, but it's putting the cart before the horse. Are you blaming the victim?
Partly, yes. Let me react to what Yanis just said. So, when the crisis struck, I remember in 2010, I was sitting in the German Bundestag, and there was a hearing of experts about, this Greek program. And, a lot of my colleagues at the time said, we have these rules, and, we shouldn't violate them, and just let the country go bankrupt and not do anything about it. And I disagreed simply because I thought, if we had just done nothing, let's assume we had done nothing, I believe what would have happened is Greece wouldn't have repaid its debt to the creditors so far. You could say, so what? But then one of the risks was, we had all these banks, German banks, French banks, banks from all over, holding these bonds. So there was an issue of the stability of banks, and then there was an issue of contagion to other European countries. So, if that had happened, a full-fledged bankruptcy, investors would have sold off Italian government bonds. It would have been the end of the euro. And maybe that's too pessimistic. Maybe there was just a 10% chance it would have been the end of the euro. But at the time, I thought, if you are really in responsibility and you have a 10% chance of getting a very bad crisis, which is a lot worse than what followed Lehman, I have to say I wouldn't do it. Now the question is, what should governments have done? And there I agree. One thing that could have been done is say, okay, we bail out the banks. So let's forget about the contagion and just look at the banks. So one solution would have been, okay, let's nationalize all the banks that get into trouble with Greek assets. So this was politically very difficult, and it's no justification, it's just an explanation, because we had just all the bank saving going on, and people were understandably angry about it. So in a way, the Greek program was a hidden rescue operation for banks. It wasn't only that, though. In the case of a bankruptcy, the Greek government would have had to reduce its expenditures by much more than it actually did. So the rescue program did help Greece up to a point. The primary deficit of Greece was so large, it would have gone to zero without a program. So there was some help that went to Greece, but true, so a lot of the help also went to the banks. I totally agree. And then later, how do you deal with these issues? My personal view is it would have been a lot better to say, okay, we write off the debt. We try to make sure that the same debt accumulation will not be possible for the Greek government in the future, and the Greeks should decide themselves how they run their economic policy. What I find very bad is this, as you say, the Troika trying to rule Greece. It's natural that this is not very helpful. Now the trouble is, if you want someone to respond for your debts, you will lose your liberty. If Mrs. Lyon gave her credit card to all of us in this room, she would want to control us, wouldn't you? And so in Europe, we have a choice. In the European Currency Union, we have a choice. Either we have a completely centralized economic political system that will never work, or we have a world where governments have great difficulties to borrow funds because it is clear that investors won't get their money back. That's basically the US system. Some of the US states practically cannot borrow, or if they do, they need to come up with some kind of collateral. Okay, and if you do that, if you come up with some kind of collateral, you pay back the debt even if you need to shut down kindergartens or you can't distribute food stamps. That's the consequence. So I think we have these two choices. Yeah, I agree, but you need to cut other spending. So this kind of responsibility for your debt is very harsh.
May I respond with 3 points? Look, the first point I want to make is not a direct answer to anything Clemens said. It's a direct answer or comment on the way you framed the conversation, which I'm not criticizing you for. It's the normal way in which these conversations are framed. It gives me a great opportunity to try to nip it in the bud. In 2008, when Wall Street was collapsing, I had already begun a campaign in Greece, warning that the Greek state was going to be bankrupt very soon, and we should not accept a bailout that simply extends the crisis into pretending that we solved it. And the next warning I issued, which made me slightly notorious in Greece, was that I was predicting that because of the structure of the Eurozone, what you said about the credit card parable, very soon, once we go bankrupt and we get into that mess as Europe, not just as Greece, very soon after that, we're going to have a civil war in Europe. The Greeks being portrayed in Germany as a particularly disgraceful species. The Germans being portrayed in Greece, exactly the same, but in a different way, awful. And very soon, European unity would be jettisoned, and we are going to lose the capacity to pull together as Europeans, to face up to what is effectively a systemic European crisis, where Greece is simply the most obvious manifestation of that crisis. And I was trying to warn my compatriots, those who would listen to me, that we must never allow ourselves to begin sentences with the words, the Germans. The Germans are like this, the Germans want that. There's so much variety amongst the Germans and amongst the... So the political and cultural point is very important. And that was what always worried me about the Euro crisis. The Euro was constructed in such a way that it would set off a series of financial crises, which would then turn real economic, and then will turn political, and then would fragment Europe and turn us into xenophobes and racists against one another, and ourselves too. That's point number one. Point number two. I agree with you. There was a massive political problem in May 2010 for Chancellor Merkel to go to the Bundestag and tell the truth. And the reason was that only a few months before that, she had secured 500 billion for the banks. She couldn't go back and say, and that was very, very difficult for the government. It was very difficult for Schäuble, it was very difficult for everyone to do. And then a few months later, they thought that this was a poison, a glass of poison which they drank, and then they would have to do it again. And a few months later, they were told, remember how much money we gave to Deutsche Bank, to Societe Generale? We need to do it again. And they thought, no. So this is my criticism now. And this is again a criticism on political lines, because what they did damaged Europe forever. They disguised another bailout for the banks as solidarity with Greeks, when the weakest of the Greeks were being taken to the cleaners. And the richer of the Greeks were left completely untouched by the Troika or by anyone else. So, just to answer your question, do I blame Germany? Does Germany blame Greece? I certainly do not believe in such a thing as Germany, in such a thing as Greeks. The Greeks or Greece. We are all in this together. I'm angrier with Greeks than I am with Germans. Because it was Greek oligarchs, it was Greek governments, it was the Greek elites that firstly created the unsustainable debts, and secondly, when they blew up, they made sure that the burden was shifted to the weakest of Greeks, and to the weakest of Germans, and to the weakest in Slovakia, in Slovenia, in Portugal, who had nothing to do with it. So that's the second point. And the third point, I will agree and disagree at once with Clemens when he said that the only way of rationally dealing with this situation, which has to do with the architecture of the euro, is by having a central government. I will agree with him that this is true, and I will disagree with him that this is not something we can do. I believe that the only solution for Europe is federation. The only way of maintaining a monetary union is by adding to it a federal union. Now, at the moment, because of the centrifugal force that we've been talking about, it is impossible to do. But that is what our task should be, and this is what our movement DM is trying to discuss at the pan-European level. First, we need to stabilize Europe by using existing treaties, existing institutions to do smart things, like, for instance, having a very large, serious, not like Juncker's plan, serious investment program that is funded partly by QE or supported by QE. Instead of buying structured debt, bonds of Italy and so on, QE should be supporting EIB bonds, the purpose of which is to start an investment-led recovery, New Deal-like program in Europe. This is my proposal. Maybe there are better proposals. But this is the kind of thinking we need in order to stabilize Europe without allowing Italy or Spain or France to go above their Maastricht limits. And once we stabilize Europe, then we will be able to have the discussion of what democratic European Union constitution for a federal system must be. If we can't do this, maybe we're past the point of no return. Maybe the European Union is finished.
What about Great Britain?
Can I react to this point, because I think it's very central. So I believe if the euro can only survive with a federal government, it won't. It's sad, but it's as simple as that. You know, I wouldn't be opposed to a federal government, but we're just not getting there. That's not what Europeans want. But I'm not so pessimistic. You know, I think we can have a eurozone. It would need to be different from all previous currency unions, and you know, doing something like that or attempting something to make something work that has never worked before is maybe a bit optimistic. But I think it's not impossible. You know, I think what we need in Europe is a decentralized union, where governments, yes, they can go bankrupt, where banks can go bankrupt, but banks are stabilized by a banking union there. I do think we need a centralized arrangement, but I think we need to find a way of having decentralized public finances, restructuring of government debt if necessary, to make the Eurozone survive, simply because I think steering the Eurozone from Brussels simply will not work. It will never work.
But Clemens, let me add one point. I agree with you. We can do a lot better than we're doing. And we can stabilize the Eurozone. But when we stabilize the Eurozone, if we stabilize the Eurozone, and that requires, amongst all the other things that you said, I agree with them, but we need an aggregate investment policy as well, not what Juncker is doing, which is just a misnomer. If we do that, I can assure you, or I'd like to be able to assure you, that
the mood in Europe will change. If European citizens see us changing the way that we are operating within the current institutions in a way that stabilizes Europe, and the dream of shared prosperity is given another lease of life, then you will see, I hope, that the discussion about federation will become much simpler. It will be like waking up from a nightmare. Suddenly, the fresh day, the light of day, creates a great deal more optimism, which will allow us to have this conversation.
Yeah, as I said, I wouldn't be opposed. I would just, we should just remind ourselves that in the early 2000s, which were relatively good times for Europe, we tried to have a European constitutional process, and it didn't work. Maybe after the experience of this crisis, things will be better. But just something very simple. I believe people in this country, people in my own country, probably people in your country, have lost trust in European institutions because rules get broken all the time. So if there ever was a willingness or support for moving powers to Brussels, it has gone away. And that's why I think we need integration, political integration in certain areas, but we need a concept that keeps this to a minimum and rescues the Eurozone. If we think we can't do that, we should look for ways of kind of orderly getting out of the Euro. That's another, without destroying the EU, but orderly getting out of the Euro. If the only alternative is having a US-type federation, I think we should better think about dissolving the thing. The Euro, not the EU.
Well, the reason why Europeans have lost trust in the institutions is because the institutions are operating in a non-transparent, idiotic manner, which is producing one inane policy after the other. And it's a democracy-free zone. Germans do not trust the European Commission. They do not trust any of the institutions of the Troika, in particular, which are actually sitting there representing I don't know whom in the Eurogroup, simply because no one knows what is being decided on behalf of whom, and no one can actually ask the important questions that democratic citizens or citizens of a democracy should be able to ask those who make decisions over them. First question is, what exact powers do you have? Secondly, who gave them to you? Thirdly, how do you use them? Fourthly, how can we get rid of you? These are questions we cannot ask in Brussels. This is why nobody trusts Brussels. Not because we have a problem with the concept of a federal government in Brussels, which is answerable to all Europeans.
We shouldn't forget that the Commission is not a government. It was designed to be the guardian of the European treaties. And I think, yes, in my own countries, in many countries in Europe, a lot of people are fond of the internal market, of the Schengen Agreement, things Europe has done. If you look at Eastern Europe, I think a lot of Eastern Europeans are grateful for the European Union because it contributed to their stabilization after the fall of the Iron Curtain, the build-up of democratic institutions. So it's not all bad. I think there are very positive things about European integration, but probably the Eurozone is not one of them. And that's why we'll have to fix it or get rid of it. But I think we can't fix it by setting up the United States of Europe.
Let's agree that we have a task to stabilize the Eurozone or to disintegrate it in a harmonious or as much of a harmonious way as it is possible. When we do that, then we can have the discussion about federation.
I can agree to that.
Who would have thought that there is so much agreement on the stage? How about some questions now? Keep them short, keep them simple. Tell us your name and where you come from. I don't see any hands. Now I see a hand. Now I see a hand. A third hand.
Is it to me? Yes. Mr. Varoufakis, you mentioned the Troika and you blamed them for pulling out the money out of the poor Greeks and not out of the rich. You were the finance minister. What did you do to get the money out of the rich people and the oligarchs?
let's collect like 2 or 3 questions if you don't mind.
Topic also has been free market economy and the further evolution of this economic concept. And my personal view is that since 2010, not only the mistake with regards to the forced bailout for Greece was done, but also that fiscal strangulation provided every European country from kickstarting the economy in Europe. Because definitely the financial and economic crisis was a very big external shock to Europe, and the wrong measures have been taken. So I'm very sympathizing with your approach of having an investment a pan-European investment initiative in order to get the European economy kick-started.
Okay, so that was a comment, not a question. Can we have another question?
Good afternoon. I just have one small question. Oh, this is working now. I just have one small question. I come from South America. It's a continent that is not integrated socially, politically, or economically. It's been trying and failing for several decades. What are your thoughts on integration where it doesn't exist? Should we push for it, and how far should we push for it, and how hard?
There's a sir standing in the back here.
The name is Wolfgang Price. How would a basic income guarantee program work, let us say, in a state like Greece? Is it conceivable that Greece could initiate such a program, or could this kind of activity only take place on a European-wide basis?
Okay, so all 3 questions, I think, went to you, right? Maybe you want to have a comment first, then.
On the Latin American question, so there is some integration, the Andean Pact. To get it going, I would start not so differently from the Europeans with free trade and free capital movements. I think that's a very efficient way of bringing people together. A lot of conflicts within Latin America happen between countries that do not trade very much. So if you do trade with your neighbors, you don't shoot at them. And I think that was important in Europe. And I think that's a positive message for Latin America. One comment on the austerity question. So I don't think that the crisis in Europe was caused by excessive austerity. I think that's wrong. Why? This is, you can address a crisis with austerity if it's a transitory decline in income. But what we had in Europe was different. It was an unsustainable path of spending in various countries. So they needed to adjust. Prices had gone out of control. Prices were much too high in the periphery. There was a competitiveness crisis. If you react to a competitive crisis by increasing government spending, you make it worse. You drive up prices. Okay, this is something Olivier Blanchard, for instance, has emphasized very much. If you have levels of spending that are permanently too high relative to your productivity, you need to contract. There's no way around it.
I'm tempted to join this conversation, but I won't because we don't have time. Just one very quick vignette that while it is true that competitiveness differences had skyrocketed before 2008, you can never correct for them through internal devaluation when you have large debt overhang. Then you enter into an austerity debt deflationary cycle as we did. That was my quick vignette. Allow me to come straight to the question that you asked me personally about what did I do about the oligarchs, and in particular, you didn't say that, but I think you intended to say it, tax evaders. Well, let me remind you that I stayed in the ministry for 5.5 months. During those months, I spent most of the time in lockerheads with the Troika. But every day, I had one task domestically. I had several, but the main one was to close all the loopholes for tax evasion and tax immunity to be in particular, and to catch the cheaters from the previous 15 years. So one of the problems one has when one enters the Ministry of Finance in Greece is that you can't trust anyone. Simply because the whole ministry even though there are brilliant people in it and very, very honest people in it, but you never know who they are, and it's very difficult as the incoming Minister of Finance to know how to distinguish them from the others who are part of the problem and can never be part of the solution. So to answer your question, I created a small team, a working group, about 8 people of untouchables, people that I could trust, more or less, people that had been brought in, and they had one task. The task was to take 2 databases. One is from our banking system, from the 4 systemic banks, to get real-time data from 2000 to 2015 of every transaction of every tax file number. And we did that. It was very difficult to extract this data from the bank. I did this personally. I put a lot of pressure into them. At first, they were really scared of me because I did not have exactly a bank-friendly aura. And therefore, this kind of fear that I inspired in them, within 2 months, we had the data. The second data set was tax returns. And the idea was to create an algorithm that from all the the bank transfers from one bank account to another, to work out a statistical model for estimating with a very, very, very small, very large confidence interval, the kind of income that one had to have in order to have these kinds of transactions per tax file number, yeah? And then compare it with their tax return. You have no idea how difficult it was as the Minister of Finance to get the General Secretariat of Public Revenues to cooperate with this team so that we can compare the transfers, the bank transfers, with the tax returns. The Minister of Finance did not have the right or the leeway to extract this data on tax returns. Imagine if Wolfgang Schäuble couldn't do it. You know, it would be a revolution in Germany, rightly so. And the reason was because this particular department was answerable to the Troika, not to me. And they were finding all sorts of excuses for delaying the process. In the end, we got the data sometime in May. I was appointed on the 27th of January. We got the data in May. By the end of June, that small team had finalized the algorithm. And they had come to me on actually the 29th of June, to be precise. And they said to me, Minister, we have established almost with certainty that we have 485,000 people who have not declared at least 200,000 euros. And in many cases, millions. We have them. And the idea was, because we didn't have in the ministry the mechanism, the legal mechanism, the accounting mechanism, the bureaucratic mechanism to check each one of these 480-something thousand cases. And you know, the Greek judicial system, if you try to prosecute them through the courts, they would get a court date in 2025, and then they would have an opportunity to appeal. Nightmare. So we were going to do that, which has happened a number of times in Germany. We didn't try to reinvent the wheel. We were going to say to them, I was going to give a press conference sometime in September, once all the data, we were absolutely sure about the data. We would say to them, in a press conference, I would look at them in the eyes and say, I know what you have done.
Can I ask you a clarifying
Yes.
question? Are you saying that the Troika prevented the Greek government from taxing the rich?
Well, let me continue.
I find that hard to believe. But
Well, I know you do. So did I. But let me complete the story and you'll see what I mean. Okay? So the idea was to say, to make an announcement, this is, you know, full transparency, this is what the ministry has done. We know the tax file numbers that have cheated since 2000. Here is a web page of TaxesNet. This is the web interface of the Ministry of Finance. You can go there anonymously with your tax file number, and you can declare additional income for the last 50 years and pay a tax, which could be actually quite reasonable, around 25%, yeah, without any penalties. And you would immediately get an electronic confirmation of that payment with immunity for prosecution for tax evading between 2000 and 2015 for the sum that you declared. Yeah? Go. You have 1 week. If you don't declare it within 1 week, we start the process of looking for you. And if we look for you, you pay 40% plus you go to jail. Or, you know, the proper law, the normal law. So that was the idea. That day, of course, the Greek banks closed. A few days later, we had a referendum, and I resigned for different reasons, reasons that had nothing to do with that. I resigned on the morning of the 6th of July. In the afternoon of the 7th of July, I get a phone call from the general secretary who was responsible for that team. He was in tears. He was saying, "Minister," I said, "I'm not minister anymore." He said, "Minister, they are disbanding our team at the orders of the Troika." On the 13th of August, you can check this, Clemens. On the 13th of August, the Greek parliament voted the third MOU, Memorandum of Understanding with the creditors. In it, it is explicitly stated, small print, that the SDOE team of the Ministry of Finance is being disbanded and reincorporated in the General Secretariat of Public Revenues, the very people who were refusing to cooperate with me. A month later, that gentleman, the General Secretary, resigned, and I can show you the letter of his resignation, which was for a few months private and confidential. It was sent to the Prime Minister, in which he explained everything that I just told you. The Troika is the Greek oligarch's best friend, and this is a big tragedy both for Greece and for Europe.
Let me comment on this. I have to say, I find it difficult to make this kind of statement here without anyone from the Troika. I cannot defend on the Troika on this detail, but I find it very difficult to make these statements because, relative to the Troika, without anyone being here, be able to defend themselves, right?
I've written about it. I've written articles about it. I've given interviews on German television, BBC, Greek television. Not once did anyone from the Troika, they've done it many times, to issue denials to things I've said. Not once have they denied that. You know why? Because I have the documents.
Follow-up question to you. I think it's safe to say that you were not very successful in having allies on the European level when you were finance minister, finding allies. If you could turn back time, would you do something differently?
Well, anyone who's asked the question, would you do things differently if you were given a chance to rewind and start again, and said no, would be a very dangerous fanatic. Yeah? We all would do things differently with the benefit of hindsight. The interesting question is, would I have done things differently with the same information I had at the time? And the answer is yes, some things, but not anything substantive. But let me say, when you ask me, I didn't find any allies in Europe. Well, this is not true.
I didn't say you didn't find any. I said
Didn't
it
you?
was hard.
It was
You were
hard.
not
Of
very
course it's hard.
successful in doing it.
Oh, but when you say I was not successful, you say I didn't find it. But let me put it this way. It is true.
I said you were not very successful in doing it.
But my answer is, look, I don't take this personally. If you want, I can easily proclaim that my ministry was a failure. It was a heroic failure, but a failure nevertheless. Okay? We Greeks are good at that. We opposed the Axis in 1940. We failed. We don't regret it, No, but let me put it this way. In the Eurogroup, it is true that, with the exception of some things that the French finance minister was saying, which I wasn't able to understand, not because he was saying it in French, but because it didn't make much sense, I didn't have any allies, except on occasion Wolfgang Schäuble, but that's another story. It is true. But, and this is of importance, that goes well beyond the history of that period, my ministry, myself, and so on. It's important to everyone to understand something about Europe. When I spoke to these people in private, we were almost always in agreement with the Italian finance minister, the Spanish finance minister, on many occasions with Wolfgang Schäuble, with the central bankers, people from the European Central Bank, you know who I'm referring to. And then you go into the Eurogroup, and suddenly you see, you look at somebody and say, who are you? And, what did you do to the person I was talking to 5 minutes ago. You're not the same person, since clearly this is an invasion of the body snatchers for anyone who's seen the movie. Yeah? Now, that is of significance for the European democratic process. It's got to do with something that Clemens was saying about the lack of trust that Europeans have to their leaders and to Brussels. And the reason why we have such a great legitimacy problem, democratic legitimacy deficit in Europe. When our representatives in the Eurogroup, in the institutions, cannot speak their mind. There is groupthink. There is the party line, which resembles the Soviet Union, because that's what was happening in the Soviet Union. They were not all idiots in the Politburo. If, from what people say to me, you would talk to people of the Politburo in private, and they would tell you, yeah, it's terrible, the whole thing is collapsing, and we're making one mistake after the other. But then in the Politburo, all of them did this. Yeah? They all voted yes. All voted yes. That's Eurogroup. That is the Eurogroup. We are reproducing the complete lack of discourse, of open and free debate within our European Union institutions that brought down the Soviet Union. Thankfully, we don't have the Gulag, but we do have a process of disintegration.
Wollen Sie antworten drauf? Wollen Sie darauf antworten?
Maybe just a short reaction. I think, one of the key issues in the crisis, and I think we agree on that, this pretend, that debt can be paid back and pretend that things are not so bad. I think, this is not something of the Eurogroup. This is a result of our democratic political process. And I don't think it would be different if we had, let's say, proper democracy at the European level. This is, you can even observe this in companies. If you have the choice as a CEO between writing down an asset and pretending it's not so bad until you're out of office, you will do the latter. So you cannot address these things by introducing some form of representative democracy, or a more accurate form or a more effective form of representative democracy at the European level. I think this is more about the way the financial sector is set up. But I'm afraid more democracy at the European level is a solution for many problems, but not for that one.
I disagree strongly. I think that you're too pessimistic about human nature and democracy. I have no doubt, running in my head what was going on in the Eurogroup. If I could press one button, things would have been much better. You know what button? The button that connects all the cameras and the microphones in there with the internet and, television stations, your station. Huh? If you could hear what was going on in there, I believe Europe would have been a better place.
We were not expected to agree on everything, so let's leave it there.
Okay, those are the famous last words of this discussion. Thank you very much for coming, Clemens Fuest. Thank you very much for coming, Yanis Varoufakis.